Hi, this is Penny. Welcome to my studio. Today we're going to look at making these two bags from thrift shop yarn scraps. Whenever you go to the thrift shop, you usually notice a pile of different yarns. And I usually go for the unusual ones rather than just the straight knitting wool. It has to appeal to me, obviously. Because if it looks good in the ball, it should, in theory, look good when it's made into fabric. So unlike the little pink clutch, which went to plan, this one didn't go anywhere near going to plan. And we'll look at what went wrong as we go further into the video. So you start with a piece 36 centimetres by 60 centimetres. The bottom of the length will turn up and the top will turn down, which will make the flap of your bag. So that's why you need that size. And then the bag's made in one piece. This is an image of the yarn that I used to make the small pink bag. And here we've got two types. One deep red eyelash yarn, deep maroon, and then a multicoloured violet toned feathery type yarn, and I have no idea what it's called, but those two I combined for the deep red bag. And I would normally just cover it enough to literally hide the background, but for some unknown reason, I just went a little overboard and I piled it on, and this layer was probably about 2 centimetres thick, which is way too much. I wrapped it in salvaged, and you can see, or I should have seen when I was doing it, that the problems are already visible because it's starting to look quilted. By this stage I'd realised my mistake, but I persevered anyway. First of all, I had to do a grid stitch lines just to hold it down, and I had nothing but problems because the cotton kept breaking. I must have rethreaded the sewing machine needle about 50 times, but I persevered despite the difficulties. The back of it is quilted and creased because of the thickness of the yarn, and that made the fabric shrink. So my base fabric turned out much smaller than I'd intended. However, it was extremely sturdy. It almost stood up on its own. It was so dense and thick. So now we'll move on to the making of the actual little pink bag. And here I used the yarn which I've shown in the beginning. I decided that I was going to put it on really thinly because of the previous experience. And I wanted something on the back that would, if it showed through, would add a bit of interest. And here's the piece at flat, and as you can see, it's got a bit thinner at certain points. I'm not sure why that is. It might have been, like I said, because I sewed it a little more densely, because I think the backing fabric was pretty straight. When I hold it up to the light, you can see then the colours of the background coming through. So it lets you see how light and airy the end result is, and yet sturdy. You can see the backing here of the fabric, and you can also see the finished yarn. It's very hard to see the underlying fabric. It does show through in an odd place, but you don't really notice it. So that means that the yarn amount was just right. And this is just a close-up of the yarn, so you can see the beautiful texture that results. The yarn had little loops in it, which came out really well. There's a comparison of the two different finishes. Both look really nice. Now they're folded as I had planned into three, and you can see that the one on the right has a lot more fabric in it. It's also turned under on the edges, so I've allowed for turn-ins there. So that's usable as I planned. But this one, you can see, is the flap is a lot shorter, and also it's shrunken across the width. And there's no way that I could make a decent sized clutch out of this. So it was, in a sense, a failure. Here you can see the piece just folded over. I haven't sewn it together yet along the sides, but I have done some hand embroidery with, I used a size 8 crochet cotton, and I used black and white, and I did some straight stitching to add a visual contrast, and also as a scaffolding to hold the flowers. It does give them something to sit on, something to visually stop them falling off the flap. I made the flowers from 3 different fabrics that had the similar colours to the actual yarn. I made them slightly warmer. I added a warmer velvet, and just to break the coolness of the pinks around it. And then I used a strong piece of bright pink to pick up the pinks in the background. And I burnt the edges again, not burnt them rather, I melted them, and then I just stacked the circles together. Before I actually did the stitching, I added a piece of thin wadding to the back of the fabric, and that gave the bag some solidity and some sort of shape. Now we can go back to the piece that was no good. Rather than class it as a reject, I thought I'd just change my plans with it, because it was still a nice piece of fabric. And I folded the piece in half and overlapped and joined it, and you see at the top of the picture is the joined area, and I just literally put a few more bits of yarn on top and stitched, and then a strip of salvage, and stitched them over the join section. You can see the end here sewn, and I've sewn across the corners, which leaves me a little triangle which I need to trim off. When you sew across the bottom of a bag and then sew the corners at 90 degrees, this is what happens outside. It's like the letter T on each corner, and it gives the bag a little bit of width at the bottom. The bag was a little bit too high, or long, so I trimmed off a section which was really too small to use for much, but it went into my scrap box of odd little bits. I made a tube of black polycotton lining and placed the right side of that against the right side of the bag and stitched around it. When you open it out, you end up with a long tube, and eventually the black lining on the right hand side of the image will go down into the bag. Fit it, push the lining down inside, and then you fold the top of the bag down so that you've got a bit of a yarn fabric inside rather than just having the lining right on the edge. And then you stitch the bottom of the lining. You determine the length of it and you stitch it across the bottom. The flower I made from a variety of similar colours. I went slightly brighter because I wanted the flower to stand out a little bit. And I used a fabric with gold on it as well, a dull gold. And again, one of the main bright purple was actually a sewn edge, which I used and just gathered. But the other shapes were circular, and I burnt the edges and attached them in the center. I think there were 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. There's a layer of velvet as well. And then right on the back of it, I made 5 separate circular petals and added those in. Again, I burnt the edges, melted the edges. And a dull gold button, reject button, made a really nice center, and I just attached that onto the bag. I decided on closing the bag by having a long tapering tab that was joined to the back of the bag and then went almost to the bottom of the front of the bag, just to make a design feature out of it. So I made another piece of fabric, and this time I didn't put too much yarn on it, and it worked really well. It was lightweight, but it covered the backing pretty well. And then I cut the shape. I made mine wider where it was attached to the bag and tapered it about 2 centimeters narrower at the long end. And it was quite long. It was attached to the back of the bag, and then it went right down the front, almost to the bottom. I turned the edges of the strip in, and then I put the flower on. The inside of the tab I covered with black polycotton. I actually sewed this on by hand, and it needs to be pressed. I haven't done that yet. I cut a tab that was 2 centimeters wider at where it was going to be joined to the bag, and tapered it to 2 centimeters narrower at the bottom. And I made it long enough that I would have a pop fastener near the base of the bag, and I also added an extra 2 or 3 centimeters on so that I could turn it up at the end. And you can see here where it's turned up. Once it's finished, I decided that I needed to visually separate it because the actual tab got lost in visually among the bag fur. And so I decided to make 1 meter of thin cord. I used 4 lengths of 8-ply black yarn, acrylic yarn, and twisted and made the cord. And I used 4 or 5 different cottons, shades of violet, shades of pink, and a couple of variegated ones, and just zigzagged right down the cord until it was covered in the colour that I wanted. I didn't want it too bright, and I didn't want it too dull. I just wanted it to show rather than stand out. So that's the finished result anyway. And then once I'd finished, I sewed on a glass bead that had a chain tassel attached to it from an old piece of jewellery, and that sort of completed it. You can see the cord going around the back of the bag here. I sewed the whole thing in one piece, 1 length of cord. So I started it at the back, and I went round the front, and then I went down the tab, and then I finished it off at the back again. So minimal joins in the cord. This image is probably very true to colour of the actual bag, and you can see how the flower is slightly brighter, but still goes with the bag. This image is of a bag that was made in exactly the same way as the little pink bag, except it was made purely with eyelash wool, a shiny variegated wool, and it used probably 1/3 to half a little ball. I'm planning a point-by-point, very, very detailed instructional video on how to make this little red bag, so do stay tuned if you're interested. If you'd like to see more of my work, go to pennyema.crivado.com, and I will put that in under the video. So until next time, thanks very much for watching, and do stay tuned to look at the last images on this video.